before they became a case, before their faces were printed on missing person flyers. Diane and Melissa Carter were simply two sisters living very ordinary lives in Alma. Diane was the older one, 29 years old, an age when many people have already grown used to carrying responsibility. She had a slender frame and eyes that always seemed focused, as if she were constantly weighing every small detail. With Diane, everything had to be in its proper place. Towels folded neatly, tools kept clean, appointments on time. People in town liked to joke that if you entrusted your hair to Diane, you could close your eyes without worry. She didn't just cut hair, she restored confidence to the person sitting in her chair. Diane didn't open the salon out of grand ambition. She did it because she wanted stability, a clear future, and a life close to family. She was engaged. She had plans. To Diane, life felt like a straight road, not rushed, but steady. Melissa was different, 25 years old, younger, louder, and guided more by emotion than reason. When Melissa walked into the salon, the room seemed to brighten. She talked easily, laughed loudly, and remembered the smallest details about her clients. Who had just gone through a divorce, who had a new baby, who was quietly hurting for reasons they rarely shared. Melissa remembered it all, and she made people feel remembered. If Diane was the one who kept the salon running smoothly, Melissa was its soul. There were days when clients didn't come for a haircut at all. They came to sit in Melissa's chair, to talk for a while, and to leave feeling lighter than when they arrived. In a small town like Alma, that kind of presence was worth more than any service. The sisters were different, but they fit together perfectly. In the mornings, Diane opened the shop early, brewed the coffee, and organized the day's appointments. Melissa usually arrived a little later, pastries in hand, smiling as she apologized. Diane would shake her head. Melissa would grin. It was their familiar rhythm, repeated day after day, so routine that no one ever imagined it could simply disappear. To those around them, Diane and Melissa were never meant to be the center of a tragedy. They were Ruth's daughters, neighbors, sisters, the familiar women who cut your hair, the faces you expected to see when you pushed open the salon door. And that's why, when they vanished, the most painful part wasn't the silence left behind at the scene. It was the feeling that two familiar lives had gone without a chance to say goodbye, as if a deeply human piece of Alma had been taken away in a moment no one realized would be the last. Alma, Arkansas, is the kind of town where if you leave for a week, returning feels as though you never left at all. The main road stretches only a few blocks. Mornings begin with the smell of coffee drifting from the corner cafe. Afternoons fade out with the sound of pickup trucks rolling by at an unhurried pace. And nights are so quiet you can hear insects humming in backyards across town. In Alma, people don't ask who you are before asking how your family is doing. They remember one another through habits, through the car usually parked in the driveway, through whether you buy pastries on Fridays or get your hair cut at the start of each month. Life moves slowly, predictably, and in that rhythm, people find a very particular sense of safety. Carter and Co-Hair Studio sat right on that main street. It wasn't big, it wasn't flashy, but it was a place women in town visited for more than just a haircut. It was where they sat down, looked at themselves in the mirror, and spoke aloud the things they sometimes couldn't say to anyone else. Ordinary stories, small sorrows, very human hopes. That's why, when the two sisters who owned the salon vanished, Alma didn't just lose two people. The town lost a familiar rhythm, a missing beat, one everyone could feel, even if not everyone knew how to name it. This story is not only about a crime, it's about how a small community faces loss. It's about ordinary people pulled into a tragedy they never chose. And it's about how sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply lies still, waiting long enough to be unearthed. Stay with me, because to understand what really happened to the Carter sisters, we have to return to the very place where everything once seemed most peaceful. The rain that night wasn't heavy. It was the familiar spring drizzle of rural Arkansas, just enough to turn Main Street into a ribbon of glass, just enough to make people walk a little faster, eager to get home a little sooner. It was close to 9 o'clock in the evening. Most of the shops had already gone dark, but the sign of Carter and Co-Hair Studio was still lit. Pale pink neon flickered through the rain, reflecting off the front window like a tired heartbeat that refused to stop. Inside the salon, Everything looked as though it was waiting for its owners to return. A curling iron was still plugged in. Two half-finished cups of coffee sat side by side on the counter. There were no signs of a struggle, no chaos. Just a strange absence, like two women had simply stepped out for a brief moment. Behind the building, a silver Buick sat motionless. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's door was slightly ajar, just enough for the rain to carry the scent of wet plastic and hairspray into the car. The next morning, the car was still there. The two women were not. 17 years passed, and the town of Alma grew accustomed to that silence. Until one day, a road construction crew struck a rusted steel barrel buried deep in the ground. Inside were not only the remains of two human beings, but 17 years of unanswered questions. 17 years of waiting and a truth the entire town had never been ready to face. The morning of the 15th of April 2004 began just like hundreds of other mornings in Alma. There were no warnings, no uneasy feelings, just a warm, slightly humid spring day, with a pale gray sky that hadn't yet turned to rain. Diane opened the salon early, almost by instinct. She turned on the lights, pulled back the curtains, and set her bag beneath the counter. The coffee maker clicked on, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the small space. An old radio near the window played familiar songs, quiet enough not to drown out the sound of scissors, but loud enough to soften the silence of the morning. Diane arranged boxes of hair dye and checked the appointment book. Familiar names, time slots that repeated week after week. For her, mornings were about putting everything in order before clients arrived carrying stories of their own. Melissa came in later. As usual, she pushed the door open with her shoulder, a bag of pastries from the nearby bakery in her hand. She smiled and apologized to her sister in the same familiar tone. Diane looked at her and gave a small shake of her head, saying nothing. It was how they had communicated for years. The first clients arrived around 9 o'clock. An elderly woman there for a wash, a young woman preparing for a job interview, a mother squeezing in a haircut before picking up her child from school. Inside the salon, the sounds of scissors, running water, and conversation blended together. Melissa talked. Diane focused on her work. Everything moved slowly, as if time inside the shop always passed more gently than it did outside. At lunchtime, the sisters ate a simple meal in the back room. Nothing worth remembering. No strange phone calls, no one who stood out. If you asked anyone who saw them that day, they would all say the same thing. They seemed completely normal. By the afternoon, the atmosphere began to change. The sky darkened, clouds hung low. A damp breeze carried the scent of approaching rain. Fewer clients came in. Diane wiped down the mirrors. Melissa cleared the stations. They talked about dinner, about weekend plans, about the small, ordinary things people talk about when they have no idea their time is quietly running out. Just before 6 o'clock, the rain began to fall. Not heavily, just enough to make people turn up their collars. The last client left with her hair neatly pinned in place. Diane locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. To Diane and Melissa, it was simply an afternoon that ended a little later because of the rain. They weren't in a hurry to leave. They stayed behind to clean up, just as they had done many times before. And it was that very normalcy, that familiarity, that would turn the 15th of April 2004 into a day Alma would never forget. As night fell over Alma that evening, the rain hadn't fully let up. It came down lightly, steadily, just enough to blur the streetlights and make the town feel more empty than usual. Main Street, already quiet, was reduced to a few scattered lights and the soft tapping of rain on tin roofs. Sometime after 7:30 p.m., people still passing by Carter and Cohair Studio noticed the lights were on. Inside, a warm yellow glow spilled onto the sidewalk, so familiar that no one thought twice about it. The sisters often stayed after closing, cleaning up, talking a little longer, stretching out the end of a workday that had long become routine. At 8:12 p.m., a patrol officer drove down the alley behind the salon. He noticed a silver Buick parked close to the wall. Nothing about it made him stop. In Alma, seeing Diane and Melissa's car there at night wasn't unusual. He drove on, carrying with him the assumption that it was just another ordinary rainy evening. By the next morning, that sense of normalcy was gone. The Buick was still there. The driver's door sat slightly open. The keys were still in the ignition, silent, as if someone had stepped out briefly and never returned. Inside the car, there was no wallet, no phone. On the back seat lay a plastic comb snapped cleanly in two, a small detail, but one that was impossible to ignore. When police entered the salon, the air felt as though it had been preserved from the night before. A curling iron was still plugged in. Clean towels hung over the chairs. Two half-finished cups of coffee sat side by side on the counter, long since gone cold. There were no signs of rummaging, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a violent struggle had taken place. In the break room, the wall clock had stopped at 8:47 p.m. No one knew why it had stopped, or exactly when, but that number 8:47 would later become a timestamp investigators couldn't forget. Outside, the rain had turned the ground to mud. Near the rear bumper of the Buick, police found a partial shoe print large, likely belonging to a man pressed faintly into the wet earth. On the door handle was a dark reddish-brown smear, later determined to be nothing more than rust. Disconnected details, not enough to form a clear picture. The scene showed no panic. It showed interruption, as if someone had told the sisters they only needed to go somewhere for a moment, as if Diane and Melissa believed they would be right back, so there was no need to turn anything off, no need to take their belongings, no reason to feel afraid. And that was what made the scene colder than any obvious sign of violence. Everything was frozen in place, suspended in the moment two people stepped away from the space they knew best. No one heard a cry for help. No one saw anything unusual, just a hair salon left lit in the rain, and a morning when the town of Alma woke up with the unmistakable feeling that something was terribly wrong without knowing where or how the search should even begin. News of the Carter sisters' disappearance spread through Alma within hours. In a small town, bad news doesn't need social media to travel. It moves through hurried phone calls, whispered conversations on front porches, and the worried looks of people stopping in front of the hair salon now sealed off with yellow tape. Search teams were formed that very day. Police officers, volunteers, neighbors, even people who had gotten their hair cut at the salon just days earlier, rolled up their sleeves and joined in. They waded along the creek behind Main Street, followed narrow trails through the woods, and checked every old shed and abandoned barn. Everyone carried the same thought with them. Maybe they were just lost. Maybe they needed help. Maybe they were still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. K-9 units were brought in. The dogs picked up a scent near the parking lot, followed it briefly, then stopped near a row of trash bins in the alley behind the salon. After that, the trail vanished. The rain from the night before had erased the most fragile traces, leaving investigators with nothing but mud and unanswered questions. The following evening, the people of Alma gathered in front of City Hall. Candles were lit, flickering in the soft breeze. Photographs of Diane and Melissa were placed against the steps, two familiar faces now more fragile than ever. There was no loud crying, only a heavy silence, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Ruth Carter stood among the crowd, holding a small candle in her hands. The unsteady flame reflected across her face. She didn't say much. She didn't collapse in grief. But those standing nearby could feel a quiet, immeasurable pain, one so deep it needed no words. The pain of a mother who did not know where her daughters were. In the days that followed, Alma lived in a state of waiting. Every unfamiliar car passing through drew glances. Every call to the police station carried a fragile hope that someone, somewhere, had seen the sisters. Cafes talked about them. Families talked about them in the evenings. Even the familiar streets felt different, as if the town had lost its sense of safety. The search stretched from days into weeks. Despite every effort, no clear trace was found. And once the woods had been combed and the creeks checked, Alma was forced to confront something more frightening than the initial fear, the possibility that Diane and Melissa Carter were no longer nearby at all, and that this search might not end anytime soon, even if no one was ready to say it out loud. When the search failed to bring answers, Alma began to do what small towns often do in moments of uncertainty. People started looking at one another, not out of malice, but because fear needs something tangible to cling to. And more often than not, that shape takes the form of a familiar name. The first person mentioned was Mark Hanley, Diane's fiancé. He was the closest to her, the man who was supposed to be by her side in the days ahead. Mark cooperated with police from the very beginning. His overnight work records in Fort Smith placed him dozens of miles away at the time the sisters disappeared. On paper, he was ruled out fairly quickly. But in the eyes of some, the suspicion lingered. In a small town, facts are sometimes not strong enough to erase a feeling. Next was Ray Douglas, Melissa's ex-boyfriend. Someone claimed they had seen the two arguing at a diner not long before. When questioned, Ray chain-smoked, his voice tight and uneasy. He said he had been home alone that night, drinking, seeing no one, no witnesses, no physical evidence. Police couldn't hold him, but his name stayed alive in the whispered conversations that moved through town. Then the rumors began to grow, faster than the truth ever could. Some said they had seen an unfamiliar car parked near the salon that night. Others believed the sisters had been abducted and taken out of town. There were even theories about drifters, about human trafficking rings, claims no one could substantiate. Each rumor carried its own version of fear, all feeding into the same question: how could something like this happen in Alma? Amid the confusion, one small detail was quietly recorded, appearing as subtly as it would later linger. 2 days after Diane and Melissa vanished, a man walked into an auto parts store on the edge of town. He asked to buy industrial adhesive and metal straps. He paid in cash. He was polite. He didn't draw attention. The store clerk would later remember just one thing: the man looked familiar. There was no receipt kept, no license plate noted, just a faint memory recalled during a late phone call. The lead was logged into the case file, but it went nowhere. Amid hundreds of tips and dozens of potential suspects, that detail was like a puzzle piece dropped to the floor, too small for anyone to bend down and pick up at the time. As days passed without new evidence, public attention slowly cooled. But the unease did not. It clung to evenings that felt quieter than usual, to doors locked a little earlier, and to the guarded looks people exchanged when mentioning anyone connected to the case even remotely. In those first weeks, Alma had no shortage of theories. The one thing it lacked was answers. And among the names that surfaced and were then set aside, no one realized that one of the most important clues may have appeared very early on, disguised as a transaction so ordinary that no one recognized it as something to fear. As weeks passed without new leads, the rhythm of the investigation began to change. Search vehicles became fewer. Volunteer groups stopped gathering each morning. The yellow tape around the hair salon was finally removed, leaving behind a storefront that felt emptier and quieter than ever before. In police records, the disappearance of Diane and Melissa was still listed as an open investigation. But in Alma, people had started calling it something else: a cold case. No one said it outright, but everyone could feel it. The urgency of the early days gave way to a habit of waiting, a heavy, exhausting kind of waiting. For Ruth Carter, time from that moment on was no longer measured in days or months. It was measured in phone calls that never came, doors that never opened, and evenings that seemed longer than they used to be. She woke up every morning with the same thought: is there any news today? And she went to sleep every night with the same unanswered question. Ruth kept her daughter's rooms almost exactly as they were. Clothes still hung in the closet. Shoes were lined up neatly on the floor. Some days, she would step inside and simply stand there for a while, as if the silence still carried the familiar presence of Diane and Melissa. She didn't pack anything away. She didn't change much. For her, leaving everything untouched was the only way to believe they might still come home. Each month, Ruth visited the old hair salon. The building was closed, but she placed a small bouquet of flowers at the door. Not for passers-by to see, but for herself. A reminder that this place had once been filled with laughter, that 2 lives had once been fully lived here. Once, she told a local reporter that she didn't need to know who had done this. She just wanted her daughters brought home. As media attention slowly shifted to other stories, Ruth's pain did not lessen. It only became more isolated. Fewer people checked in. Fewer phone calls came. What remained was a mother and a void nothing could fill. In Alma, life gradually returned to what looked like normal on the surface. But for Ruth, everything had stopped on the 15th of April, 2004. She lived in a stretch of time frozen in place where hope was not strong enough to comfort her, but never small enough to disappear. And that waiting, carried on year after year, became one of the quietest and most painful parts of this story. About 2 years after Diane and Melissa disappeared, when the case had all but sunk to the bottom of rarely reopened files, an envelope with no return address arrived at the Alma Police Department. No unusual postage, no obvious warning signs, just a thin letter, the handwriting unsteady, as if the writer had hesitated for a long time before putting pen to paper. The message was brief and direct. "Look near the creek. You're missing something right under your nose." There was no name, no explanation, no request for a response, just a sentence suspended somewhere between hope and fear. Investigators did not ignore the letter. They returned to the area behind Main Street, where a narrow creek wound its way past low brush and long-forgotten debris. For 3 consecutive days, they trudged through mud, cleared trash, and examined the ground meter by meter. They searched not with complete certainty, but with the feeling that if they let this moment pass, there might not be another chance. They found many things: old bottles, rusted metal, fragments of lives discarded, as the town slowly changed over the years. And then they saw it. A large steel barrel, rusted, heavy, lying at an angle, half submerged in mud. The barrel didn't smell. There were no fresh signs. It looked like industrial waste abandoned years earlier. When investigators tried to examine it more closely, they realized it was too heavy to move on site. They took notes, marked the location, and in what seemed like a very small decision at the time, they left. The letter was filed away. The barrel was documented, and the search once again stopped at the edge of helplessness. No one realized that in that moment, they had been closer to the truth than ever before, close enough that only one more step would have made the difference. But truth, like secrets buried deep, is not always ready to be found. Sometimes it lies in silence, waiting for enough time to pass for a small mistake to turn into a lasting regret. And for Alma, the barrel that was overlooked that year would become more than just an investigative detail. It would come to symbolize all the what-ifs that followed. 17 years after that rainy night, Alma had changed in many ways. Some shops had closed. Some families had moved away. The children who once sat waiting while their mothers got their hair cut at Carter and Cohair had grown up, built lives of their own, and carried only faint memories of the 2 sisters who once owned the salon. In the spring of 2021, a construction crew began work on a road expansion project along Riverbend Road, not far from Main Street. The job unfolded quietly, like any other machines digging into soil that had rested undisturbed for decades. No one suspected that beneath the damp, brown earth, something was waiting to be uncovered, until an excavator blade struck metal. The sound was dull and heavy, different from rock or tree roots. The workers stopped and looked closer. Beneath the mud lay an old steel barrel, rusted and warped by time. No one said it out loud, but everyone sensed this was not an ordinary find. When the lid was opened, silence fell. Inside were the skeletal remains of 2 people, carefully arranged and wrapped in layers of plastic that had long since deteriorated. 17 years of waiting, 17 years of questions suddenly given physical form. The news spread through Alma with startling speed. Those who had lost hope stood still in disbelief. Even those who had never known the sisters felt their throats tighten. But what stunned investigators wasn't only the remains. Tucked between the layers of plastic was a faded slip of paper, a receipt from an auto repair shop. The date printed on it read the 17th of April 2004, 2 days after Diane and Melissa disappeared. On the line marked customer name, one name was still clearly legible: Edward Walsh. To outsiders, it was just a name. But in Alma, it sent a chill down the spine. Edward Walsh was a local, a mechanic who had once gotten his hair cut at the Carter salon. A familiar face, one no one had ever suspected. Police immediately reopened the case. Old files were pulled out. Details once overlooked were re-examined under a new light. For Ruth Carter, the call from the police that year was the moment she had both waited for and feared for 17 long years. She knew answers were coming. She also knew those answers would never bring her daughters home. The year 2021 marked the moment Alma no longer had to ask where Diane and Melissa were. But it also opened a new question, one just as heavy. Who was Edward Walsh? And how could the truth have lain beneath the town itself for 17 years, waiting to be unearthed? Eddie Walsh was not the kind of person you remembered long after meeting him. He wasn't loud. He didn't stand out. He wasn't the kind of face that made people turn their heads when he walked into a room. In Alma, Eddie was known simply as a skilled mechanic, someone who fixed cars quickly, accepted cash, spoke just politely enough, and then went back to his work. Everyone who later reflected on their interactions with Eddie said the same thing. He seemed normal, too normal, the kind of person you could stand next to at a diner, exchange a nod, and then forget almost immediately. And it was that very ordinariness that allowed Eddie to blend into the town for years without raising suspicion. But when investigators began peeling back the layers of Eddie Walsh's life, they found that beneath the quiet exterior was an inner world full of fractures. Eddie grew up in an unstable home. His father struggled with alcoholism, and tension was a constant presence in the house. Eddie learned early on how to withdraw. He spoke little, avoided conflict, and carried with him a lingering sense of being overlooked, one that followed him from childhood into adulthood. Former co-workers said Eddie was deeply sensitive to jokes at his expense, an offhand comment, a laugh at the wrong moment. To others, these were minor things. To Eddie, they lingered. They replayed in his mind, twisting into shame and slowly into anger. Eddie didn't know how to express that anger. He didn't react right away. He didn't argue. He didn't explode in front of others. He swallowed it. And that prolonged silence compressed his emotions into something distorted, far more dangerous than an open outburst ever could be. When Eddie came into Carter & Cohair's studio, no one thought it was unusual. He was a regular customer, quiet in the chair, saying little, watching everything through the mirror. In a space filled with laughter and women's conversations, Eddie existed on the margins. And sometimes, all it took was an unintentional remark, an unexplained smile, to trigger everything he had been carrying for years. Investigators believe Eddie did not walk into that rainy night with the intention to kill, but they also believe that at some point, a final boundary was crossed. Not because of deep-seated hatred, but because of a feeling of being dismissed, looked down on, made to feel small. What made Eddie Walsh truly frightening was not any obvious cruelty. It was how much he resembled everyone else. He went to work each day, fixed cars, paid in cash, greeted people politely, and carried inside him a storm no one could see. When Eddie died of a heart attack in 2017, no one in Alma believed he had taken a terrible secret with him to the grave. But the truth is, his death did not bury what he had done. It only delayed the moment when the town would be forced to confront something deeply unsettling. That, sometimes, evil does not look like a monster. It wears a familiar face, and it lives among us quietly until it's too late. After Eddie Walsh's name surfaced on the receipt found inside the barrel, the investigation was reopened with an entirely different level of seriousness. What had once been pushed into the dusty corners of memory was pulled back into the light, and it was then that investigators realized this story did not end with Eddie. As they re-examined his relationships, one name rose to the surface: Lyle Warren, Eddie's cousin, who lived not far from Alma. In the old files, Lyle had been questioned briefly, but nothing had ever tied him firmly to the case. This time, police returned and noticed something no one had before. Lyle appeared tense in the way of someone who had been carrying a burden for far too long. A search of Lyle's garage led to an unexpected discovery. Inside an old wooden trunk, investigators found belongings once owned by Eddie: receipts, tools, and a roll of undeveloped camera film. When the film was processed, most of the photos were unremarkable. Cars, corners of the workshop, everyday work. Until the final frame. In the grainy image, two women stood in front of a hair salon. Light reflected off the glass. The angle suggested the photo had been taken from inside a vehicle across the street. Though blurred, the faces of Diane and Melissa were unmistakable. The timestamp showed the photo had been taken on the afternoon of April 14, just one day before they disappeared. This was no keepsake. It was evidence of surveillance, a moment when Eddie stood outside the sisters' world, watching silently, carrying thoughts no one else could see. The discoveries didn't end there. In the same trunk, Police found a small, leather-bound notebook, Eddie's journal. The early pages were filled with work notes, neat and methodical, but as the entries continued, the handwriting became increasingly erratic, sentences fractured, emotions spilled beyond restraint. Repeated lines spoke of being laughed at, dismissed, looked down upon, of being made to feel small. An entry dated April 15 mentioned the rain, the noise inside his head, and a desperate desire for them to understand. There was no direct confession, but what was written painted a clear picture of a man slipping past the boundary of control. The final piece came from the barrel itself. When it was re-examined using modern forensic technology, specialists detected traces of DNA that did not belong to Diane, Melissa, or Eddie. The material was faint, degraded by time but sufficient for comparison. It matched Lyle Warren. Confronted with the evidence, Lyle could no longer maintain his composure. In his statement, he admitted that on the rainy night in question, Eddie had come to him in a panic, saying things had gone too far. Lyle claimed he never touched the sisters, but he did help roll the barrel to the creek area and cover it with dirt and debris out of fear, and because Eddie had threatened him. According to Lyle, the anonymous letter sent years later was the only way he felt he could ease his conscience without directly facing the consequences. When all the pieces were placed side by side, the final picture emerged, leaving no room for denial. Eddie Walsh committed the crime, but Lyle Warren helped bury the truth for 17 years. And in that moment, the Carter case ceased to be only a story about a killer. It became a story about silence, about fear, and about the price paid when people choose not to speak the truth until it is far too late. When the remains of Diane and Melissa were finally returned to their family, Alma entered a moment many had waited for over 17 years, but one no one was truly prepared to face. The funeral was simple, held on a hill overlooking the creek where the truth had once been buried. There were no long speeches, no noisy cameras, just familiar faces aged by time standing quietly together in the soft wind. Ruth Carter sat in the front row. She did not cry out loud. Her grief seemed to have passed beyond tears. When the two caskets were placed side by side, she rested her hands on them for a long time, as if she were finally touching what she had been searching for nearly 2 decades. This time, her daughters were no longer somewhere out of reach. They were home. After the funeral, Alma did not return to what it once was, and perhaps it didn't need to. People began locking their doors earlier. Shops no longer stayed open late when only women were inside. Conversations that once felt harmless now carried a layer of caution. The small town had learned a costly lesson about how fragile the feeling of safety can be. Carter and Cohair Studio never reopened. The old sign was taken down, but in Alma's memory, the place still exists as a symbol not only of tragedy, but of 2 women who lived with kindness, who brought joy to others through the smallest of things. The story of Diane and Melissa does not end with a courtroom verdict. The person responsible was no longer alive to face justice, but it ends with the truth, and for many, that alone is a form of justice. Because sometimes, what matters most is not punishment, it is knowing, it is naming the pain, it is being able to say goodbye. And it is the reminder that evil does not always come from something distant or unfamiliar. It can grow out of silence, out of wounds left unhealed, and out of moments when people choose to turn away instead of speaking up. This story ends in Alma, but its echo remains a quiet reminder that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually rise to the surface. And when they do, the only thing left for us to do is face them with honesty and with compassion for those who no longer have a voice.